Welcome to the FDA Grand Rounds. Today's topic is on advancing real-world evidence in FDA regulatory decision-making. Our presenter is Dr. Marie Bradley. Dr. Marie Bradley is a senior advisor for real-world evidence in the Office of Medical Policy within our Center for Drug Evaluation and Research here at FDA. Her responsibilities related to real-world evidence include serving as lead for the Advancing Real-World Evidence Program, the Real-World Evidence Subcommittee, and a portfolio of real-world evidence demonstration projects. She also evaluates complex real-world evidence-related study protocols submitted to FDA. And recently, she's been helping drive the agency-level RWE initiatives in the Office of the Commissioner. She's an established advocate, speaker, and panelist across national and international platforms on real-world evidence-related topics, and she participates extensively in external engagement. She's a pharmacoepidemiologist and a pharmacist with over 16 years of experience working in regulatory, government, and academic sectors in the United States and the United Kingdom, including 11 years here at the FDA. She has a PhD in pharmacoepidemiology and a master's in pharmacy degree from Queen's University, Belfast, as well as a master's degree from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So welcome, Dr. Bradley. Thank you so much for taking the time to present today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rakesh. I'm very happy to be here, and we'll just get stuck in straight away. Next slide, please. So this is my disclaimer. This speech reflects my views and should not be construed to represent FDA or HHS views or policies, and I have no conflicts of interest related to this presentation. Next slide. These are the objectives that were already mentioned, so we can move to the next slide, please. So I'm going to cover, for those of you who are less familiar with real-world data and real-world evidence, I'm going to start with some of our FDA definitions. I'm going to move into our FDA real-world evidence program, our approach to evaluating real-world evidence, and then finish up with discussing an FDA-funded real-world evidence-related demonstration project. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is real-world data and what is real-world evidence? These are standard definitions from the FDA 2018 framework. Real-world data are data relating to patient health status and or the delivery of healthcare. Note that are routinely collected from a variety of sources. Some of the most common sources are electronic health records, medical claims data, registries, also with input from digital health technologies and things like questionnaires. And then real-world evidence is really the clinical evidence that regarding the usage and potential benefits, risks of a medical product that is derived from analysis of real-world data. And notice that real-world evidence can be generated across multiple study designs, not limited to randomized controlled trials, pragmatic clinical trials, externally controlled trials, and observational studies. Next slide, please. And so, you know, the spectrum of studies I just mentioned are shown here to demonstrate the ways in which real-world data can be used in the different study designs. So starting here on the left with randomized controlled trials, real-world data can often be used in planning clinical trials to assess trial feasibility, to support selection of trial sites. And then, but importantly, we need to note here that this would not be considered real-world data generating real-world evidence. However, moving into a more pragmatic type clinical trial, where potentially key outcomes in the trial are identified using, for example, medical records data, that would be deemed to be real-world data generating real-world evidence. And you can see, you know, that all three of the next sort of grouping of study designs would be considered real-world data generating real-world evidence. And that's an important distinction. So moving next to an externally controlled trial, this is a non-randomized interventional study, typically where the external control group will be derived often completely from real-world data. Sometimes they are hybrid. And then move into, you know, a wholly observational study, non-randomized, non-interventional study where all of the data in the study would be real-world data generating real-world evidence, and the spectrum of demonstrated here really demonstrates increasing reliance of real-world data across the different study types. Next slide, please. And so interest in real-world evidence can really be attributed, I believe, to the 21st Century Cures Act of 2016, at least in the interest in the last 10 years. And the 21st Century Cures Act mandated that FDA evaluate the potential use of real-world evidence in medical product approvals. We're also in an era of big data with improved access to and rapid analysis of real-world data. And there's been increasing research showing that, observational studies can generate results similar to trials. There have been other factors such as the COVID-19 pandemic. Certainly in the last 5 years, we've seen more of an uptick in various data sources, and the pandemic represents a time when the speed was a huge concern, and so real-world data became highlighted there for its ability to provide evidence quickly. And sometimes there's confusion, what does this mean? Real-world data, real-world evidence, observational studies, but we've been using observational data and observational studies for decades to look at, safety in the post-market space here at FDA. Researchers have been using real-world data to answer questions on etiologic research for many decades. And so just to highlight that, there's new terminology and buzzwords, but the underlying methodology isn't actually that new. Next slide, please. And so the 21st Century Cures Act of 2016 that I mentioned mandated that FDA expand the use of real-world evidence in regulatory decision-making, particularly with an emphasis on supporting a new indication for a drug that was already approved under 505C, and again for post-approval study requirements. It's important to mention that the standard for substantial evidence has not changed. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about our FDA real-world evidence program, and next slide, please. And I want to emphasize that when I say FDA real-world evidence program, this largely refers to the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, so Center for Biologic Evaluation and Research, and the Oncology Center for Excellence, as the Center for Devices and Radiologic Health have a separate program. However, we do work together on various initiatives, and particularly recently across the agency at the Commissioner's Office level, we have been working on various initiatives together. And so the FDA 2018 framework really outlined a plan for a multifaceted program to implement RWE, and it was there are sort of 4 key areas within that plan: internal agency processes, external stakeholder engagement, demonstration research projects, and guidance development. I'm going to speak a little bit about these in the coming slides. Next slide, please. And so within the FDA real-world evidence program, we have various internal processes. And so any submission that comes into the agency containing real-world data, real-world evidence, the clinical review divisions typically consult teams in OMP and OSE and DB with the relevant expertise in epidemiology and statistics to provide expert input on submissions containing this type of data. We also engage AI and DHT as needed. We also have a real-world evidence subcommittee, and that is a cross-cutting forum for RWE evaluation and policy development. And we have leadership representatives from CDER, CBER, CDRH, and OCE. CDER staff can consult this when, for example, they have a challenging or complex submission that they want help with evaluation on. We also offer listening sessions to external parties, and you can see in this box on the side some of the recent listening sessions that we have and we're very fortunate to have. And so external parties will come in and talk about potentially a new data source, a new platform, a new methodologic approach, or sponsors can come in and ask questions about, a plan they have for a submission that would use real-world evidence. And so really want to plug this, you know, if anyone out there is interested in coming in and, you know, educating us on something that we should know about, or asking us questions on issues pertaining to real world evidence, real world data. We have some dates in 2026 that will be available. We also track submissions to the agency for CDER and CBER and report annually as part of a PDFA 7 commitment. Next slide, please. We also engage in a lot of external engagement, particularly internationally through ICH, regulatory agencies, other regulatory agencies, and ICMRA, and we are members of external working groups and some of the professional societies like ISPE and ISPOR. We host and conduct FDA and centre level public meetings and webinars on RWE, and we often get requests to speak on panels at various meetings, and so we have engaged extensively externally on various events, and we have published a range of papers related to RWE generation also. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, we fund, one of the facets of our program is to fund research relevant to real world evidence, and we call these demonstration projects. And this slide really shows the Office of Medical Policy's demonstration project categories. We fund a large portfolio in the Office of Medical Policy, and there's some snips here of some of the outputs of the types of projects that we have funded in the past. We've funded about 26 to date, with 10 currently ongoing, and other offices in the Oncology Centre for Excellence, the Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology, and within the CDER Centre, other groups are funding demonstration projects as well. Next slide, please. Another thing that I want to draw your attention to is our Advancing Real World Evidence program. And so this too was a PDFA 7 commitment that was launched in 2023. And really the idea is to have the sponsors come in very early in their process when they're considering the use of real world evidence in a regulatory submission. And they will come in and, you know, speak to us about it, discuss it in an attempt to help improve the quality and acceptability of submitted RWE. This activity is also very valuable for promoting consistent decision making, because we get input across CDER, CBER, OCE, and the various divisions there, and a lot of SMEs participate, and also shared learning both between the FDA staff and the industry. It's also a really good opportunity to highlight publicly, you know, the characteristics of real world evidence. It's often not efficient, you know, to educate sponsors on an individual submission. In this way, we can really highlight publicly some of the characteristics that can and cannot support regulatory decisions. Sponsors are able to request up to 4 meetings with the agency through this pathway. It's an optional pathway, and the traditional pathways remain. And we have semi-annual submission deadlines of March 31 and November 30th. To date, we've had 6 cycles of 29 requests received, 6 accepted, and 3 completed, and 3 ongoing, and 23 denied. Next slide. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about our FDA approach to evaluating real world evidence. Next slide, please. So our approach is very much a 3-pronged approach, and the key considerations are, you know, are the real world data fit for use in terms of their relevance and reliability? Is the trial of the study design used to generate the real world evidence adequate for generating the scientific evidence that's needed to answer the question? And then whether the study conduct meets regulatory requirements. And this would include things like, you know, the importance of pre-specifying a protocol, and that FDA review it and finalize before any analyses are initiated. You will be surprised sometimes that, you know, people that come in that have already started analyses. Also, the ability to submit patient level data to the FDA for reanalysis, and the ability to trace the data back to its source for FDA inspections. Next slide. And so I mentioned that guidance was one of the important facets of our program. And this table shows a list of 8 different FDA RWE guidances from the CDER, CBER, and OCE program. And CDRH also have a separate guidance where they combine multiple domains in one. These guidances cover topics related to real-world considerations and standards, study design considerations, and regulatory and procedural considerations. 3 of these guidances are still in draft form and are currently being revised based on the very helpful comments that we have received from external stakeholders, and we anticipate that these will be completed in the next few months. Next slide, please. And so rather than go through all of these guidances, I wanted to provide some key select messages. And this relates back to, our approach to evaluating real-world evidence, really ensuring that data are fit for use, that they're reliable and relevant for the study question. And when we say relevant, that means that they capture all of the study elements that are required for the study. They comprise the target population, and they capture all of the healthcare encounters that the patient has. And we also, focus on data reliability, so how accurate, complete, and traceable is the data, ensuring the study design is appropriate and that very specific study elements are correctly specified. We often encounter challenges, especially in the externally controlled trial type study design, challenges with appropriately specifying the index date, which is a date at which the patient, enters the study and is eligible to enter, and then starts follow-up for outcomes and starts treatment. So we always recommend consulting with the FDA early and often. And sometimes hear people say, how early? As early as possible, because, before any sort of solid decisions are made, so that, we can review and advise if there's anything that might be contrary to a successful submission. Ensure all analyses are pre-specified in the protocol and SAP, as I mentioned previously, that these patient level data are available, and that, if you're submitting real-world data to FDA, that it needs to be formatted to acceptable FDA standards that are outlined in the data catalog. And then for externally controlled trials, really ensuring comparability of data between treatment and external control arms. And there is a table in the externally controlled trial guidance that outlines some of the key considerations when designing these types of trials. Next slide, please. And so I'm going to talk about some of the reasons that we see as to why, RWD, RWE submissions fail. This is not an exhaustive list. I've just selected some of the reasons that I encounter commonly. One of the main reasons would be data sources. And so it's really important to make sure, and it's very challenging when we understand this, that important study elements are captured in the data source. And so, we've seen examples of, completeness challenges where a lab test is required to define a condition or an outcome. And then because there aren't complete lab results for the entire patient population, we have to exclude, or the sponsor has to exclude, substantial numbers of suitable patients due to this incomplete lab record. And also issues of traceability, where potentially data can be traced back to the vendor only. The identities of the actual data partners are unknown, and this is just unacceptable for the regulatory considerations that we have for using this data. Design and interpretation. So often the use of an inappropriate comparator in externally controlled trials. Often the control group, potentially from a real-world data source, have clinically important differences in disease and care between the groups. This is a huge challenge. Problems with non-interventional studies as well, with unmeasured confounding. For example, the data source don't capture these, and so you can't adjust for them. As I mentioned, the index date, and just differences in how outcome measures are treated, and the outcome measures are identified and defined and treated in control groups. Next slide, please. The other thing is the regulatory considerations, and these are very challenging. So typically a sponsor does not own the real world data that they want to submit to the FDA as part of their submission, and they often need permission from a third party data vendor to submit the FDA for FDA to keep. We have record keeping requirements that mean we need to hold on to it for a substantial amount of time. These can be major burdens, and there are various paths that we have proposed to work around this, but it's very challenging, and we are working on some policy solutions to try and make this a little easier. The use of appropriate data standards. So, you might have to convert the real world data from its native format to a format that is typically used for clinical trials, and this can be problematic because it can lead to data loss and all sorts of issues. And we're really working on trying to identify an appropriate data standard, and potentially a more appropriate data standard for real world data studies that would be more efficient. And sometimes an interventional study is feasible, right? Sometimes we get these great proposals for, a non-interventional study or an externally controlled trial, and sometimes interventional studies are actually feasible. Next slide, please. This table shows a selection of CDER approvals that relied in part on real world evidence. It's not a complete list, but I just wanted to show it to demonstrate, the various types of designs that we accept. We have externally controlled trials, cohort studies, even randomized controlled trials that are actually generating real world evidence that's being used in regulatory decision makings. And in this case, most of these are used to demonstrate substantial evidence of effectiveness and confirmatory evidence, and across various different conditions, many of which are typically in the rare disease space. Next slide, please. So I wanted to spend the second half of my presentation talking about one of our OMP-funded real world evidence demonstration projects, RCT Duplicate. And so next slide, please. Oh, and the PIs for this project are Sebastian Sneevice and Shirley Wang from the Division of Pharmacoepidemiology and Pharmacoeconomics at Brigham and Women's Hospital. We fund this project, and we participate, in technically advising them and everything, but they are the leads. So next slide, please. And so just to give some background, so around the 1990s, there were some overly simplistic hierarchies of study design that have been proposed, which really designated RCTs as the gold standard and suggesting that non-randomized studies that would use real world data were not as trustworthy. And many of you are probably familiar with this study design pyramid. Next slide, please. And so, oh, sorry, there must be some animation in this slide. So if you could just click again. Thanks. And so this debate continued over the decades with positions published in top medical journals supporting RCTs as the only reliable approach, and others countering that well-designed observational studies are comparable to RCTs. Next slide. And this debate actually continued, as recently as 2020. As you can see, this article in the New England Journal of Medicine, the magic of randomization and the myth of real world evidence, and then a counter argument, and another journal sort of challenging the interpretations of these authors. And so these arguments really formed the rationale for the need to better understand the extent to which real world data studies can produce similar conclusions to RCTs. And this led the PIs to come up with the idea of RCT Duplicate, and FDA funded this 3-part project. Next slide, please. And so again, just to better understand the extent to which real world data studies conducted using healthcare claims databases can provide similar conclusions to RCTs. And so I'm going to mention part 1 and 2 first. Part 1 concerned the emulation of 30 completed trials of drug effectiveness and safety between 2007 and 2017. And part 2 is concerned then with predicting 7 ongoing trials using the same approach. And some of the anticipated learnings were really what factors can predictably increase the validity of studies that generate real-world evidence, and which type of clinical characteristics can be answered. What are the characteristics of clinical questions that can be answered validly in real-world data studies using health insurance claims data? Next slide. And so at the start of this project was really, deciding which trials to include. And so we identified published trials. They had to be relevant to regulatory decision making. And most importantly, they had to be replicable in health insurance claims data source, which is no easy task. And so, the ability to replicate the critical aspects of the trial protocol and the claims data was a key consideration. And, the critical aspects would be the primary outcome, the treatment strategies, the inclusion-exclusion criteria. Key confounding variables needed to be measured in the claims data, but also balanced in the feasibility analyses. And we had to have sufficient patient counts in the claims data sources as well. And these trials either supported a regulatory decision or could have. There were 23 pivotal trials and 7 negative trials. And the trials were across multiple therapeutic areas that are listed here. Next slide, please. And so there were 3 US healthcare insurance claims data sources that were used for RCT duplicate. The first being Optum's Cliniformatics Data Mart, IBM MarketScan, and then subsets of Medicare, which is a public health insurance claims data source, parts A, B, and D. And the other 2 are commercial claims data sources. And each source contained de-identified information for covered healthcare encounters of patients enrolled in these participating health insurance plans. And there were analyses of patient-level data conducted in each database separately, and then the results were pulled together for the final results. Next slide, please. And so we selected binary agreement metrics in order to quantify the agreement in the RCT and RWD pair. So, you're conducting this study in claims data to try and replicate the findings of the randomized controlled trial. And you need something to measure, how well they agree. And so the regulatory agreement was the ability of the real-world data study to replicate the direction and statistical significance of the trial finding. The estimate agreement was when the real-world data study estimate effect lied within the 95% CI, so the treatment effect estimate from the trial, and then the standardized difference agreements between the treatment effect estimates. In order to enhance transparency and reproducibility, all of the real-world data study protocols that were used in these emulations were pre-registered on clinicaltrials.gov before conducting analyses to prevent results-driven design choices. Next slide, please. And so the findings from part 1, which as a reminder is the emulation of the 30 completed trials, where the real-world data studies using claims data generally reach similar conclusions to RCTs, which is promising. And this is indicated by the Pearson correlation coefficient of 0.82. There were high levels of agreement across the 3 binary metrics. 50% of the selected RCTs could be emulated closely regarding the design and analysis in the real-world data. And what we found was that these more closely emulated RCTs found comparable treatment effects. And when we did a post hoc analysis, including only those trials that were closely emulated, the correlation coefficient went up into the 90s. Findings were more likely to diverge if there were substantive emulation challenges. And this is because potentially when there's substantive emulation challenges, you can be answering a different question or there can be bias. Next slide, please. So this is a little busy. These slides show the results for trials 1 through 11, which were studies on diabetes, antiplatelet drugs, and antiplatelet drugs. pay attention to the two columns on the right. So the first shows how closely each trial was able to be emulated in the real-world data. And the second column shows the level of agreement in the three binary metrics. And it's very clear, you know, that among the trials that were closely emulated, there was more likely to be agreement across the three binary metrics. And in those where there was not close agreement, there was less likely to be agreement across all three. Next slide, please. These trials evaluated treatments for AF, VTE, and hypertension, and were all able to be closely emulated. And as you can see, this also predicted how much agreement there was in these binary agreement metrics. But, you know, there are some cases where even with close emulation, there was no agreement, and there can be many reasons for this, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Next slide, please. And so trials 23 to 30 covered, were trials of drugs in various different clinical areas, and there was no close emulation in any of these trials in terms of using the real-world data source. And as you can see, that predicted pretty poor alignment in the binary agreement metrics. Next slide, please. So one of the big challenges with, emulation of even a single randomized control trial is you're making hundreds of subjective decisions regarding how to emulate that RCT design and how to control for confounding. And as we saw in the previous slide, some trials were easier to emulate than others, and this tended to give better results. But it's really important to differentiate between emulation differences and then differences that result from bias in the real-world data study. And so some of the reasons for emulation differences between the RCT and the real-world data study are outlined in this first column, and they include problems with inclusion-exclusion criteria. I remember when we were doing this, a few years ago, like being amazed at the list of inclusion-exclusion criteria for some of these trials, and it's just really difficult to apply all of those in claims data. Claims data often just don't have the complete patient history. They lack things like biomarkers or imaging results, and they often don't document patient symptoms. There can also be vague exclusion criteria in trials. So things like the physician suggests that the patient might not survive, which are very hard to replicate in real-world data. There's run-in periods as well, for example, where in a trial, patients might all be put on a certain drug before randomization. Very difficult to emulate that in the real-world data. Differences with treatment strategies, mimicking the RCT treatment strategies can be very different. Adherence is very different in clinical practice, and so are the treatment augmentation schedules often. Outcome ascertainment can be very different. In a trial, it can be much more complex and multifaceted compared to the real world. And then follow-up, many patients in the real-world data studies, they fail to reach the end of follow-up due to there's a large turnover in these healthcare insurance plans, and so they move in and out of different plans. And also for consideration, clearly, I think anyone who's familiar with real-world data studies, there are actually differences between the arms of the real-world data study, so the people receiving the treatment of interest and the comparator arm, and these can result from confounding, either unmeasured or mismeasured confounders that might predict the outcome. Outcomes can be assessed differently between treatment and non-treated arms, or even comparator arms, so there's differential surveillance and misclassification. And again, that long-term follow-up and informative censoring can be a problem in these studies. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, I didn't realize there was animation there. And so after confirming that real-world data could reproduce the results of completed RCTs, the next step was really to see whether real-world data could accurately and prospectively predict outcomes of ongoing trials. And so whenever real-world data studies prospectively emulate trial protocols and produce similar findings to ongoing trials, it really further increases our confidence in the ability to reach causal conclusions. And so the questions are really, can the real-world data study predict an RCT result that has not yet been released? And can this be done without hindsight bias? And I think one of the problems with, retrospective emulation is, we're human, and some of the analysts can, design can be informed by what we know about the results, and it's very difficult to be totally objective. Next slide, please. And so these are the results of the 7 ongoing phase 4 trials. Again, there was close agreement on a lot of these, and a lot of regulatory estimate and statistical significance agreement. You can see the SOUL trial here, that the RCT estimate 0.86, it was 0.85 in the real-world evidence study, and really, really similar. And these were all conducted before the trial results read out, so it's impressive. And then there are other examples where it's not so impressive, and we need to investigate that a little more. Next slide, please. And so in summary, this is really, I'm going to skip over this. I think the next slide, it just supports the conclusions from stage 1. And, we need to systematically and evaluate any concordance and discordance in these RCT RWE pairs. Next slide, please. And part 3 of RCT duplicate is the BenchExCal, benchmark, expand, and calibrate. Next slide, please. And so if you have a causal study design and an analytic approach that were applied and relevant and reliable data sources to emulate a previously conducted RCT for the drug of interest, and it's found to closely replicate the results, it has been suggested that this setup could then be used to evaluate other closely related effectiveness questions. And so this is an innovative trial emulation approach designed to enhance the use of real-world evidence for supporting indication expansions of marketed medications. And so basically the results of a first stage trial emulation that is intended to increase the confidence of a second stage emulation of a hypothetical target trial or real-world data study for an expanded indication, by providing assurance that design data measurements that were used in the first stage were sufficient to closely emulate the trial. And this gives us confidence that we can use these to predict the results of a real-world data study. Next slide, please. And so this schematic really shows the BenchExCal. So you have step 1, where you, similar to RCT duplicate, part 1, you get an RWD study to emulate a previously completed trial. And then you quantify any divergence, and you might tweak some parameters as a result of the learnings from these. Then you use the information to expand, to ask a new question. And so you use the design data measurement and analytics setup from the initial benchmarking to emulate a hypothetical RCT or a real-world data study that would be used for a new indication. And then you can calibrate this based on your learnings from stage 1 to conduct sensitivity analysis to really attest the robustness of the finding from the hypothetical RCT. Next slide, please. I won't spend too much time on this, just to say that BenchExCal is ongoing. An initial set of trials have been selected for empirical evaluation of the 2-stage emulation approach. These are NOAC trials related to NOAC use, so changes in the surgical site of the indication for the NOAC, and then changes in the patient population and the comparator, and then some RCTs of glucose-lowering drugs, which are also going to be used to trial the approach. Next slide, please. And so I wanted to finish up talking about some of the limitations and the key learnings. And so some of the limitations are that we assume that the RCT that we're comparing to is internally valid, and that is not always guaranteed. The apparent agreement between the RCT and the real-world data study pairs can result if the effect of multiple factors cancel each other out. So it's not always, indicative of a true alignment, and that's something that really needs systematic and nuanced evaluation. RCT duplicate focused on health insurance claims data. If there was EHR or other real-world data sources, that could have led to selection of a different set of trials that would be easier to emulate with that additional data. And then there was often differential capture of some of the outcomes across the claims databases, so potentially more reliable capture of Medicare mortality in the Medicare data and compared to some of the commercial claims data sources. The results may not be generalizable beyond highly selected feasible trial designs, and it's particularly challenging for rare outcomes and complex interventions or novel therapies. I mean, the ability to emulate is very challenging. Next slide, please. And so some of the key lessons learned. So, it's very obvious from the results that, RCT study designs can be closely emulated and have findings, in real-world data studies that highly correlate. It's most valuable when these design elements from the RCT can be closely emulated, but in reality, this may be difficult to achieve. There are many highly controlled clinical trials out there that cannot be emulated with real-world data. The quality of the emulation is always highly dependent on data availability and study design complexity, making it most suitable for only certain types of clinical questions. And there's difficulty in disentangling the influence of the emulation differences versus confounding bias in RCT RWE study replication. And great care is needed when interpreting the findings. Next slide. And, we always say this at FDA that real-world evidence validity can be highly context dependent. That's why we say, come and speak to us early and often. One size does not fit all. Careful consideration of the unique challenges of every question is required. Simple success metrics don't always tell the whole story, even if there's agreement on these metrics. As I mentioned, it can be due to other things. And it's very important to systematically evaluate even the successful emulations. However, I do think it provides a framework for evaluating when real-world data studies using claims data could potentially help inform clinical and regulatory decisions. Next slide, please. And I wanted to draw attention to just the sheer amount of work that went into this 3-stage project, and BenchExCal is ongoing. We're anticipating results from some of the empirical evaluations soon, but this list of papers is not complete. There are some more recent papers, and there have been a massive amount of interest in this, and the PIs have been, speaking about this widely, and it's been very successful, very successfully received. Next slide, please. And so in terms of acknowledgements, I'd also like to acknowledge the PIs for all their hard work and the great learnings and outputs that this work has resulted in, and their team and the collaborators from Aetion. There was an FDA team, we funded a lot of the study and provided significant regulatory guidance along the way. And there was an expert advisor panel as well. Next slide, please. So thank you for listening, for your attention. I wanted to reiterate, if there are any questions that maybe people don't want to address now, we have a CDER RWE mailbox, and we're always very happy to hear from people if you have questions on our real-world evidence subcommittee or our Advancing Real-World Evidence program, or anybody's interested in a listening session. Please don't hesitate to reach out. So thank you very much.